restrictive on free speech. We do want them to be protective of our people, right? So speech that will promote or incite others to commit crimes against other members of our society, we want the government to be able to, in some ways, not censor, but maybe restrict, right? Not a ban, but a restriction on that kind of speech.
Where does that free stop?
It's true. That's the question.
It's almost like our laws that the police can't do anything till a crime has happened, even if you know that it's very likely going to happen. It's sort of the same thing. We can't do anything until after the riot has happened.
That's kind of true, but we have restraining orders, right? There are mechanisms where, it's true, we've lost the art of conversation, the art of being able to disagree with someone but still have a conversation with them.
And it's apparent in our government, and it's sad.
Yes.
Big part of that falls right on the lap of the universities today. They're probably as guilty as anybody. Once you fry those young kids' brains, it's hard to understand.
Let's blame it on the media. Let's just blame it on the media. Yeah.
I have a question about many people hate political right, and what do you think about political right and freedom of speech?
Political speech is
No, I mean, like, you can see this kind of thing, or can see that kind of thing. There's a political right, correct? Or
politically correct. Okay. Yeah, no. You know, I mean, I think that's a fallback position in terms of don't say hateful things. Well, I have the right to say whatever I want, right? I think that goes back to respecting other humans, respecting other people. It's. I think we use that term political correctness.
It's a form of diminishing free speech. That's the purpose of it.
Well, that's the idea behind political correctness, right? That it is a restriction on free speech. But just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, but I think political correctness is a good thing, right? Let's remind you not say something too offensive to others. So
Well, you would think, but it's not viewed that way.
It's also less offensive. So
Right.
political correctness could be supportive of communalism,
Yes.
but it still is somewhat restrictive or offensive for those people who feel that they are constrained.
Right.
But if you are not political correctness, you are not no charge or not some legal responsibility to that, right?
Well,
people think, oh, this guy is not polite.
Well, I mean, right. Is it a question of being polite or being accepting of other people? I don't know. I mean, if again, because you have the right to say it,
Yeah.
is it that important? Is your right to say it that important that even though it hurts other people, you're still going to say it? Because I think that has more to do with you as a human being than it does with whether somebody's trying to suppress your free speech rights. I mean, you have the right to say it, but if it harms other people, why? It just, I don't know, maybe that's something that's not a legal perspective, that's not like, that's not a professor perspective, that's just like a human being perspective. Why is it necessary to, to say things that harm other people? Just because you can? Yes.
I'd like to come back.
Okay. Yes?
Thank you for your remarks. I have a question of you because you're an educator. Essentially, the question is, how many generations are we, from your perspective or your opinion, away from that respectful public square?
Wow.
And I raise that because of two observations. I live in Franklin County, Fairfax to be exact. I'm within walking distance of the school. For the last school year, a number of the classes there have been studying things like that focuses on Hitler, the rise of hate. They've been looking at systems, oppression, different forms of government. And I have been just awed by the insight and wisdom that these youngsters from the middle school to high school bring to discussion. Conversely, my wife is go-to manager in the senior citizens complex, 55 and over.
More ideas, right? Just, there's so much more for them to learn and to learn from, right? The rest of the world. And I think that that greatly shapes our hope for the future, right? In that I think that if they have access to people who are, or at least ideas that are outside of maybe the ideas they have been taught, grown up with, they at least have an opportunity to experience and see the world as a more connected place, as opposed to a us and them place. I think that moves us in the right direction. I'm not sure of how long that will take, right? But if you look at how our society has changed in recent years, if you look at LGBTQ rights, right, and how quickly that that issue has moved, has morphed. You know, if you think about our students' parents and their parents, it's light years from where it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, right? So I think you're right. I think there's hope for the future. I think that there is this notion of the world is getting smaller because we have the ability to be more connected as a world community, and I think that that works in our favor. So it's moving us in the right direction.
You're a media professor.
I am.
Do you ever talk about or study like the elimination of fairness doctrine and the ownership of media in major metropolitan areas by, it used to be you can only own one media outlet.
Yes.
And now one company will come in and buy several media
Yes.
outlets. They control
Yes.
the thought, so to speak, for that neighborhood. I've always thought those two things have had a real polarizing effect. on
We
what's
do.
happening in this country.
We do. We talk a lot about conglomeration. We talk a lot about media ownership, and about who controls the media, right? Because what you have access to is what they tell you what to think. They tell you what to think about. They tell you, yes, they shape you very drastically. Yeah.
I'm going to let this ownership thing go because you'll find that newspaper print or television stations, their viewership is going down by leaps and bounds.
Absolutely.
Instead, now we have this wonderful creation called the cell phone that has apps. In the app, you click on it and it says, oh, based on your recent click history, these are the news articles that should be interesting to you.
Yes.
Little alarm bells are going off in my head saying, I'm brainwashing myself
Yes.
every time I touch the screen.
Absolutely. Yes. We also look and spend a lot of time studying analytics in terms of how the current media system, right, using.
I wanted to thank you so much for such a great.
Sure, thank you.
Everyone, I'm Wendy Hisco, the director here, and we're here to have Professor Tracy Griffith, who's from St. Michael's College. She's the chair and of the Media Studies, Journalism, and Digital Arts Department. And she's here to hopefully have a great talk. I'm excited to have you here.
Thank you.
All right, so welcome.
So, welcome, good evening. So I'm going to start off our conversation about free speech versus hate speech, keeping in mind that I am a teacher, right? So we're going to start off with a little quiz. All right, okay. So the handout that I gave you talks about the differences between free speech and hate speech. What are the criteria? What does the First Amendment protect? And we'll get a little bit deeper into it as we go along. And I am totally open for questions or comments. We're very informal, okay? All right, first question on our quiz. When is it okay to talk about candidates being killed? Okay? So, conservative political commentator tells his House he needs to be taken out, and I can do it in a heartbeat. What do you think about those statements? Are they permissible? Are they acceptable? Let's take a look. If you had to pick one, which one would you say is acceptable? The first one? Okay. You're right. Okay. In the second instance, he was convicted of making repeated threats against then-candidate Obama. But Ann Coulter, who made the first statement, was not arrested, right? It was perfectly fine in the context of political commentary, protected under the First Amendment. Let's move on to the next one. Okay. Police response. Church members show up to a soldier's funeral carrying picket signs that say, "Thank God for dead soldiers. God hates America." From a legal perspective. Under the First Amendment. First one. Anybody know what this one's talking about? Westboro Baptist Church. Yes, absolutely, right? Westboro Baptist Church, as much as we might not like what they say, they have the First Amendment right to say it, right? That's one of the protected rights under the First Amendment, to protest. Other cases, in the second one, this happened in Oklahoma, and in that case, what's Oklahoma? Minneapolis, sorry. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court said, no, you can't specifically target individuals for that kind of hate speech. Okay? Let's move on. Sorry. Their invitation. On the other side, again, public university, openly chides a law professor, right, who has a party at her house, her private house. Students, faculty, she shows up, greets them in blackface, right? And she says she used this as a means of explaining the racial disparities in America. It's a question of whether or not she's going to be in some way sanctioned for blackface.
Whether she is sanctioned for blackface.
Yes.
And the party in her home was a private party or a party for her students?
It was students and other faculty were in attendance.
It seems that one of the university acted
Incorrectly. Okay, so we're going, first one is allowed. Okay.
So we're suggesting that the one on the left, public university, should not have rescinded the speaking invitation. They were concerned with security risks. They should have still accepted the speaker.
Is that what we're saying? No, what we're saying is, say that again? CNN? Yeah. And this was, as I say, it was at Auburn.
Safety, is that what you're saying? Is creating an unsafe situation?
You could use them interchangeably almost.
I don't like it, but I kind of go along with it if you're dealing with a safety issue. But like somebody else said, they shouldn't have invited him if they didn't have the security in place.
Sure. Yep.
The Spencer guy, it didn't help. I mean, he has hasn't got a chance to talk. So it's a kind of similar, I think. Yeah, maybe authority think it might be involve some
Security.
security issue, but actually it's a kind of sensor, I think.
It could certainly be perceived that way, and that is, of course, the way that Richard Spencer perceived it, right, as a form of censorship.
Yeah, I don't like general good.
Okay, that's a great question, right? Is censorship ever okay for the general good? And we'll talk about ways in which the government can legally censor, right? So the approach with Richard Spencer, the safety and security issue is one area in which the government has the ability to, it's not necessarily aimed at censoring, right? But it's a balancing act. You're balancing rapper Ronald Klump, the clown rapper, is representing. Do we have problems with either one of these two? Which one of these is most problematic? The one on the left. Okay?
But who's in the clear is the one on the right.
Okay? There we go. Absolutely. I think that one was a little easier. Right? Okay. We're looking at what constitutes, what's protected under the First Amendment. Okay, keep that in mind. We've got a survivor of child sex abuse, and she writes about incest and child molestation and rape. Okay, also talks about torturing and murdering kids. On the other side, we've got a pornographic magazine. They publish a fake ad featuring a famous televangelist. And the televangelist is talking about, supposedly talking about, the first time that he had sex with his mother. The latter, this second one, actually became a legal case. Does anybody? Jerry Falwell and Hustler? Yeah? Yeah. Really? Okay. No. Right?
That means if you do something wrong or criminal, you cannot get rich.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. But in this one, she's not saying that she committed the crime. She's the victim of the crime. Right? But you'll find that as we go through, that the First Amendment very clearly excludes any kind of child pornography. Whether it's a depiction, description. I think this one's our last one. Which speech is protected? Which speech is protected? Which do you think? The guy describing a Sandy Hook. Which one is protected? Which is protected speech under the First Amendment? Yes, and the interesting thing is, this speech was made by Milo Yiannopoulos. Sound familiar to anybody? Yeah, he talking about the crime is not necessarily a crime. Threats, specific threats, with specifics about what happened. Depicting or describing sexual conduct in a patently offensive way is obscenity, and it's not protected by the First Amendment. Whereas he just simply praised pedophilia. This guy, Yiannopoulos, just simply praised pedophilia. The one before was specifically talking about specifics of the act of pedophilia.
Okay, so it's because this one didn't go into specifics?
Exactly. He didn't depict or describe it in any way. He just said it was great.
Okay. So if he had gone into specifics, then it would not have been protected?
It probably would not. It would not have been protected. Depicting or describing sexual conduct.
Specifically?
Apparently not. Okay, let's look at how hate speech has basically come about. And we'll look at some of the examples that we met in the quiz are some of the guys that we're going to talk about here, right? So three basic people that I'm going to kind of focus on tonight in terms of looking at what qualifies as hate speech. Milo Yiannopoulos, Richard Spencer, and Charles Murray, okay? First off, and I put this on the handout as well, this is our First Amendment, right? The First Amendment, we're not talking about the religion clause tonight. We're talking specifically about the First Amendment, the aspect of the First Amendment that deals with free speech issues, okay? So Congress, meaning government, in order for protection of the First Amendment protects citizens against government infringing on, and here's the list, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to peaceably assemble, right, and to petition the government. The First Amendment protects citizens against the government. The government cannot infringe on these aspects of free speech, right? And obviously, over time, free speech has not just meant words that are coming out of your mouth. Free press has not just meant written word, right? It's been interpreted throughout case law to include the technology that currently exists, right? So the government can't infringe on your free speech right, even if it's over the internet, or even if it's, standing out, based on the technology that currently exists, right? Government cannot infringe on those rights. Okay, so let's understand what we're working with here in terms of any private entity has the ability to infringe on your free speech rights because they don't grant you free speech rights, right? The rights and the responsibilities are defined within the Constitution. This aspect of the Constitution gives to the American citizens rights conferred upon you by the government. The government gives you these rights, and they cannot infringe upon them. Yes?
So if I say something hateful in a public place, the government cannot do anything to me, depending on what I say.
Yes.
My employer could fire me.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And one of the prime examples of that, I don't know if you had followed or seen the guy who was fired from Uno's after he participated in Charlottesville. Right. Uno's is a private business. They can decide who works there and who doesn't. Okay? So, but if he had worked for the library, right, the library would have had a hard time firing him for participating at Charlottesville because it's a public entity and he has the right, unless they could somehow show that he wasn't peacefully assembling, maybe he was the one throwing rocks. But if, right, the library would have a hard time sanctioning him in any way because they are a public, they are part of the government. Yes?
But if he said some, if the private entity fired him,
Yes?
can he sue the entity with the labor law?
No, because when you work for a private company, you don't have a right to work for that company, right? Yeah.
So that should be told
I'm sure they must.
But if there is nothing that happens before you are hired,
I'm not a labor lawyer. Let me just say that. But I'm sure that he might have some kind of redress if he was dealing with a company that had fired him for no cause. But then again, maybe he just works at will. I don't know. It depends on the company, depends on the contract, depends on a whole lot of other. Yes.
So you mentioned the library. When government with a big G, is that the federal government or would it be like town government too?
Thanks for asking. Okay, so you'll notice that it says Congress, right? So when the First Amendment was first put into place, it meant federal government, right? And through a case called Git Law, G-I, all levels of government. But that only came about after it was interpreted that way through the Git Law case. Other questions? Okay, so we know what we're working with. We know what the First Amendment protects. Okay. Let's look at hate speech. Right? So if the First Amendment protects speech, your right to speech, in whatever form and using whatever medium, right? Hate speech is speech that is specifically intended, right, to, I shouldn't say cause harm, but it is an expression of hatred, right? It's an expression that's aimed at communicating some distaste for something, or someone usually, right? And that distaste for that person is usually based on some protected category, race, religion, sexual orientation, national origin, disability, etc. Okay? So this is what we're working with in terms of hate speech. And we recognize that there's so many different things